Hello and welcome to season 3 of Mystery Murder Mayhem. This is episode 91, and we've got lots of new and exciting things that are coming this year, including exclusive merchandise. How can you get that merchandise? I'm glad you asked. All right, so I hate to sound like every other podcaster out there, but I started a Patreon. The bills don't pay themselves, and as you know, I'm still a full time student. I really enjoy doing this podcast, and I started it as a hobby during the pandemic, but I want to continue doing this podcast, so any little bit helps. Now, there's 4 members of membership, and each one has benefits. And after 3 months of donating, depending on which level you choose, you'll receive merchandise ranging from stickers to hoodies. And the link for the Patreon is in the episode description tonight. All right, moving on to tonight's episode. So, a couple of weeks ago, my youngest son, Nick, and I were talking about a recent episode that I had recorded, and he mentioned something that I hadn't heard about a well known serial killer, and I was shocked that I didn't even know that. Nick asked me which serial killer had taken the handle off of the inside of the passenger side car door so that his victims couldn't escape. Well, I had to Google it, and I was surprised to find that it was John Wayne Gacy. How did I not know this? And then he asked me if I had did an episode about John Wayne Gacy, and I told him no, because the main reason that I haven't done one so far is because, well, every true crime podcast has talked about him. But since Nick asked, I'm going to do it tonight.
Welcome to Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem.
Probably one of the facts that we all know about John Wayne Gacy is that he dressed as a clown to cheer kids up at hospitals, or he entertained at birthday parties. If you've seen pictures of him all made up as a clown, you know that is a creepy sight. And I think I've mentioned this before, but when I went to Alcatraz East in Pigeon Forge almost 2 years ago, they had 2 of Gacy's clown costumes on display. And being that close to them was kind of nauseating. But that crime museum is great. And if you ever get to the Pigeon Forge area, you should definitely check it out. And they had toys that belonged to Kaylee Anthony on display, and that was really heartbreaking to look at. But they also had replica cars of the ones that was owned by Bonnie and Clyde, Ted Bundy, the Bronco that O.J. Simpson was driving in that famous police chase, and there was some other cars there too that I can't remember right now, but that was pretty neat to see. But anyway, I got sidetracked there. So now Gacy, he really didn't fit the typical serial killer profile, and a lot of them are like loners and they're reclusive and they kept to themselves, but not John Wayne Gacy. Everyone who knew him said that he was this very friendly guy and he was well adjusted. He wasn't one of those folks that people say, oh, we always knew something wasn't quite right about him. He owned this successful construction company, and from it, he was earning around $250,000 a year, and that's a lot of money for back in the 70s. Like I mentioned earlier, he would dress up as a clown and visit kids in hospitals and orphanage, and he even dabbled in local politics. And John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942 to an upper middle class family in Chicago. And if you're wondering, yep, he was named after the Hollywood star from Western type movies, John Wayne. I guess his dad thought that John Wayne, the movie star, was a hero, so he named his kid after him. But over the years, his father, whose name was also John, was disappointed to realize that his son was nothing like the man he'd been named after. John Wayne Gacy was somewhat overweight, and he wasn't a bit interested in participating in sports. And another thing that disappointed his father about him was that he would often wear his mom's underwear. One thing you should know about the elder John Gacy is that he was an alcoholic. And when he would be in one of his on one of his drinking binges, he would mentally abuse Gacy by calling him a sissy, and he would physically abuse his wife. And a lot of times that he would go into these abusive name calling tirades, it would take place when John Wayne Gacy was trying to help his dad in the basement with like home improvement projects or something like that. Well, after his arrest, John Wayne Gacy told CBS that he loved his dad even though he mentally tortured him. He has also said that his dad never sexually abused him, but he claims to have been abused in that way in his early childhood and that it started when he was only 5 years old. He said that his mom was in another room while they were visiting friends. And a 15-year-old girl who lived at that home where they were visiting took John Wayne upstairs to her bedroom and she fondled him. And he said that his mom and the girl's mom walked in and saw what was going on, and the girl's mother struck her. Well, then when he was 8, it happened again, but this time it was a friend of his dad's who had done it to him. And apparently it had happened more than once because this man would come pick him up and take him out for ice cream and then show him what he called wrestling holds. And after it happened a few times, Gacy told his dad about it, so his dad ended the friendship with that man. I mentioned earlier that Gacy isn't the typical serial killer, and we can take that further by saying that even as he was growing up, there were no red flags like bedwetting or torturing small animals or starting fires, because we hear so much about that. Like, as kids, they did weird things like that, but not John Wayne Gacy. But now, he was abused, and it's been said that he was also an abuser, and it's believed that he sexually abused kids in his neighborhood when he was as young as 7 years old. Time passes, and now Gacy is 18 years old. And he's tired of his father's abuse, so he heads west to Las Vegas, where he finds work as a mortuary attendant. But he didn't keep that job or his Vegas address long because things he witnessed at that mortuary he found very disturbing. And he was back in Chicago in just a few months. Well, once he moved back to Chicago, he enrolled and earned a degree at Northwestern Business College. And after graduation, he joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And while he was a member there, he claims that he was sexually assaulted by another member. Also during this time, Gacy meets and falls in love with a woman named Marlene, and soon they are married. In 1966, the couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy's father-in-law owned several KFC locations, and he made Gacy the manager of those. So Gacy had a lot of things going for him. A wife, and they had had 2 kids. He had a great job, and he had high aspirations. In Waterloo, he joined the Chamber. I don't know why I can't say chamber today, but he joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce and was named Man of the Year for his ability to recruit new members. But everything wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Only 2 years after the couple had moved to Waterloo, Gacy was arrested on a sodomy charge. He was found guilty on that charge, but the entire time he was in prison, he claimed that encounter had been consensual. But the victim had been a 15-year-old boy that he had talked into giving him oral sex. More teens came out and said that something similar had happened to them, but get this, the community that he lived in believed he was innocent, even though there were other allegations, and even though he was found guilty and sentenced to prison. So his community was like rallying around him, even though they already knew that all these people were saying that it had happened to them. Now, during his time doing that sentence, he was friendly with the guards there, so he got special privileges. He minded his manners while he was there, so instead of him serving the 10 years that he had been sentenced to, he was released after just 2 years. But while he was still in prison, Marlene filed for divorce, and he lost his position as manager at KFC, so he moved back in with his mom in Chicago. His father had also passed away while he was in prison. He he started working odd jobs around the city, and he saved up enough money to start his own construction business. And he also, after he had his construction business going, he moved to this quiet neighborhood. 1972 would be a big year for Gacy. He married his second wife, Carol, and he committed his first murder. There in his new neighborhood, he became a well-known figure in local politics and the Moose Club. His new wife, Carol, didn't stick around for long, though, because she was starting to see these little red flags that didn't sit well with her. And one of those red flags was a strange smell coming from the crawl space under their house. After she left, Gacy started opening his home up to young men that worked for him or those who just needed a place to crash for the night. Often he would pursue sexual relationships with these young men, and even though news of this going on in his house was getting out, he didn't lose his status as that prominent politician or Moose Club member. Now, it was through the Moose Club that he started dressing up as a clown and visiting children. He said it was a form of relaxation for him. And as creepy as clowns can come across, he didn't use that character to lure young men to his house. Now, he would often pose as a police officer or just pick up these men at bus stations. John Wayne was well liked by his neighbors and was respected as a businessman and local politician, like I said. But sometime around 1975, the police started keeping tabs on him. Boys in the area had been coming to the police with stories of a man named John who had tried to get them to get in his car. Well, the name and the description that these boys gave matched John Wayne Gacy, so they started watching him. Soon they realized that a lot of young men were coming and going from his home. But after talking to some of these men, they found nothing sinister about it because they found that these men were part of Gacy's construction company. What they didn't tell the police right away, though, was that Gacy had sexually assaulted them. And they wouldn't give police that information until right before his arrest. Over the next 3 years after they started watching Gacy, police would pay him visits because of multiple cases that had happened involving young men and young boys. There was a 9-year-old boy who had gone missing. A 19-year-old had told them that Gacy had kidnapped and sexually assaulted him, and a 27-year-old said that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Gacy did end up being charged with battery in the case with the 27-year-old, but that claim was settled with a $3,000 fine. But y'all, through all of this, his community still saw him as this upstanding man. Now, before I talk about how he was caught, we need to talk about the victims in this case. It's known that there were 33 young men who were murdered by Gacy. 5 of those victims have never been identified. The first known victim of Gacy's was a teenager named Timothy McCoy. On January 3rd, 1972, Gacy picked him up from a bus stop, brought him home, had drinks with him, then after sexually assaulting him, he stabbed him to death. McCoy was found buried in the crawlspace underneath Gacy's home. One by one, Gacy murdered more and more young men in the same way. Over the following years, he murdered John Butkovich, Darrell Sampson, Randall Reffett, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll Jr., James Hackinson, Rick Johnston, Kenneth Parker, Michael Marino, William Bundy, Francis Alexander, Gregory Godzik, John Schitz, John Prestige, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy Jr., John Mowry, Russell Nelson, Robert Lynch, Tommy Bolin, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Langan, James Mazzara, and Robert Piest. All of these men were so young. They ranged in age from 14 to 21. And the ages of the 5 that haven't been identified range from 14 to 30, but those are approximate ages. All of these were killed over a 6-year period of time. So, how Gacy got caught happened like this. Police were out looking for Robert Piest on December 12th, 1978, who had gone missing just the day before. Piest had told his mom that he was going to talk to a man about a construction job, but he never came back home. His mom filed a missing person report, and soon police figured out that John Wayne Gacy was the man that Piest had gone to speak with about that job. Authorities called Gacy to come in for questioning, but he decided to not show up. And actually, what he did instead of showing up for that questioning was he was basically dumping Pius' body in a river. Of course, him not showing up sets off alarms, so a search warrant is obtained for Gacy's home, his vehicle, and they start watching Gacy like a hawk 24/7. The first time, all they found that linked Pius to Gacy was a receipt found in Gacy's home. The next time they searched, though, officers smelled that odor that can only be described as the smell of death. But they weren't able to locate any of the missing boys, and they had to release Gacy from custody. In the meantime, Gacy lawyered up, and that lawyer started building a case against the police, saying that they were conducting what he called illegal searches and seizures. On December the 20th of that same year rolls around, and police still aren't able to locate any human remains, but they did find on his criminal record that sodomy charge in Iowa, back when he lived in Waterloo. The next day, they arrest Gacy again and put him under interrogation. Gacy's lawyer admitted to police that Gacy had confessed to around 30 murders. Now, over the next almost 3 weeks, Gacy's home went through a meticulous search, and it was then that authorities started locating the bodies of victims that Gacy had murdered and dumped in that crawl space and other parts of the home and in nearby rivers. Gacy did confess to those murders, but even though they had his confession, he couldn't be charged with murder until the bodies were identified. Some of those bodies had been decomposing for years, and that added to the task of, identifying them. So another thing that made that even harder was that some of these boys who had been missing, their families, they didn't even come forward to try and help identify them. And I don't know why anybody wouldn't, but it just kind of seems like you would want that closure. But he was finally charged on January the 10th, 1979, with 7 of those murders, but he pleaded not guilty, even though he had already confessed. But soon that number of murder charges started rising, and on March 17th of that same year, 32 bodies had been linked to Gacy. And the following month, he was indicted with 26 more murder charges, so there was a total of 33. And Gacy's trial wouldn't start until February of 1980, and during that trial, Gacy tried to get himself acquitted on grounds of insanity. That didn't work, and after a trial that went on for a month and jury deliberations that only took 2 hours, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Well, while he's sitting on death row, more bodies were identified. And after the appeals process, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the age of 52 years old. So what about those door handles that I mentioned at the beginning of the show? Well, it seems that Gacy had picked up a young man that was hitchhiking home from college. All of a sudden, on that ride home, Gacy took a different route, and the young man told him he was going the wrong way. Gacy laid his hand on the young man's leg and just gave him this creepy smile. Gacy had to slow down for traffic, and the young man saw his chance, so he jumped out of the car and ran. At the time that happened, the young man didn't know who Gacy was, but a few years later, he was startled to see that familiar face on TV, and even more startled when he learned that Gacy had been arrested for murdering 33 young men. That young man's escape taught Gacy a lesson. Soon Gacy took the handle off the car door so there would be no more escapes. Now, I believe seeing that and knowing I had been in the car with him would have been enough to make my blood run cold. And that young man could have very well been Gacy's first victim. I'm glad he decided to take that chance and jump out of the car. And his story would have had such a different outcome if he hadn't. All right, y'all, that's all I've got for tonight's episode. Don't forget to come and join me on Friday night for an all new What the Friday.